Welcome to another episode of Fly on the Wall with Josh Hill. I'm Josh Hill. Today, I'm joined by Rachel Vickery, a former international gymnast who's moved into human performance, working with elite athletes, special forces operators, and increasingly, cyber professionals. The common thread for these weird, diverse groups, performing under pressure, dealing with scrutiny, and with complexity. We're also going to talk about in a world where we're building AI at pace, we're not building human capability at the same rate. Rachel, thanks for joining me. What have I missed in that intro?
Josh, well done, first of all, on that intro, and we can reference that later. Thank you so much for having me here. It's an absolute privilege to be here. I don't think you missed much at all. Obviously, I work across multiple domains as you reference, but I think really the simple way to look at it is that I work with people who are expected to make really good decisions and operate and execute with excellence and efficacy, and sometimes in some environments lethality, in very complex and high consequence environments. So the domains that I'll work into are multifactorial, and on that, looking outward at it, sometimes people are like, man, those look really disconnected, but actually fundamentally, the human operating system, which is the space that I work in, is the same and is the common theme and thread through all of those. So I'm not trying to teach someone to be a better NBA basketball player or a better cyber professional or a better CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company insofar as the technical skills. I'm very much that through form underneath all of that.
Yeah, talk to me about the human operating system, because I remember that really resonating with me in the first thought process. And as you say, it's a broad kind of skill set that everyone needs, but probably is under thought of, under realized.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I mean by the human operating system, right, is are we able to show up in that state that has our smart decision making online, really awesome cognitive bandwidth, our situational awareness is great, so we can see and we can perceive and we can hear things really, really well. Do we communicate in a way that is optimal, gets our message across, but also we're a good recipient of all of that? And then more importantly, our task, or not more importantly, but as importantly, our task execution. So our, in some environments, fine motor skills is very important. So depending on those arenas, it will depend on which of those things. Do you need more situational awareness, which you do in some environments? In some environments, you need more decision making under pressure. In some, you need fantastic communication, right? So, but it's, are you operating in that fight and flight nervous system where, even though we need that in some environments elevated, we certainly want it still within the sweet spot? Or are we operating with the nervous system online that's just the really calm one? And as humans, we've got, if we keep it really simple, we've got two key ones, the fight, flight, the rest and digest, or the sympathetic, which is the scientific, or the parasympathetic. And we're always fluctuating between those two. And there's neither a right nor wrong in them, but it's understanding which one have we got online at what point in time. And usually in high consequence moments, we will have more of that sympathetic or that fight and flight online. However, is it operating in a state that's still below our threshold of when performance and execution can start to really fall apart if we cross a certain line? So that's what I mean by the human, operating state or the operating system. But there's a lot more that feeds into that is often in the grey. It's really hard to put into a box of, that's the science and the neurophysiology, but there's also a lot of deep humanness that feeds into that, which is also fundamentally part of our human operating system. And when I'm working with organizations, so I get to work both with individuals sometimes where they really want to go deep because they really need to execute, and maybe they're carrying a lot of consequence in their role. Or sometimes I'm working with a team or a whole organization where we're looking to how do we optimize the whole organizational system so that we're intentionally designing for that reproducible success and execution in those environments. So where do you want to go here?
And I want to come back to that part, but let's go back to the beginning, because I want to talk about your experience and how that's fed into your lived experience, right? That's kind of got you through this experience to now where you are. Professional, international gymnast. Talk to me about that kind of process and for you, maybe where those worlds started to collide and where you learned, hey, look, pressure, working under it in your own world before then realizing it in other people?
Yeah, fascinating sport, gymnastics. One of the things that's unusual about gymnastics compared to a lot of other teams by the time you make it onto the international team or the professional side is that you're very young. So I was 13 when I first hit the international team. I was a junior, but first international, I was 13 years of age, up until about 19. So I was 6 years on the international team. And gymnastics is a sport where you don't have an adversary, right? You don't have a competitor who's trying to, knock you off the beam, so to speak, right? So it really does come down to you and your ability to do the things that you do over and over and over again in training. And then, of course, in a competition, it's can you do that stuff under pressure when it counts? And I was a really good competitor generally, except that I had this one very difficult way I'd start my beam routine, and the beam is 10 centimeters wide. And so the margin of error of trying to balance on that when you're somersaulting and you're often blind to your landing, and you're just reliant on, I've done this over and over again. I know where my body is in space. And I had this very difficult move, and I could do it in training. I could do it in low pressure competitions. But I remember my first international, I fell, and that set up a failure spiral after that, where every time I came into a big international in particular, where in my mind there was a lot riding on it, I'd be in my mind thinking, oh, if I fall, I'm going to let the country down, what's the punishment from the coach going to be, all of this crazy noise, which is really ironic because the country was going to be just fine if I fell off the beam, right? But as a young person, how I layered that pressure and consequence of outcome was pretty significant. And so I would work with the traditional sports psychology, mental rehearsal, self-talk, all of those traditional things, and I couldn't crack it. And it was often labeled as is commonly when you see, and think your audience can probably bring to mind really easily any professional sports person that they know who is very good, and then they talk about them choking under pressure, right? And it's often thought of as being a mental problem, like a mental weakness, or it's a character flaw or whatever. But what I didn't have an understanding of all of those years ago was, as I was coming in to do that move that my body was very familiar with, because of the pressure, the consequence, how I was framing it. I was a little bit outside my comfort zone. Maybe I was competing in an environment I wasn't used to competing in before. Because of that change in my human operating system, right, my timing would change, my depth perception would change. And it was like I was this human doing this skill almost for the very first time. So it was actually more of a body and a physiology issue, neurophysiology issue, and a biomechanics issue than it was a mental one, which is why with the traditional mental skills training, I couldn't solve it, right? Because, and I see this in the environments I work in now, often where people will still think, oh, if I'm having problems with pressure or execution or handling high consequence, it goes in the psychologist box, or sometimes it even gets pigeonholed into HR or well-being, and it completely misses some really critical pieces of what happens to humans, really predictable when we put them under pressure. And then more importantly, how do we intentionally design to give people the skills up front so that doesn't become a problem. And so, coming back to the gymnastics, it cost me a medal at a really large international competition, and I retired not long after that. And it always stings, and of course you get on and you move on. And then I went into college, and then my professional career started. But I always, even through my professional career, kept coming back to, why is it that humans are so phenomenally capable of doing things until we put them into high pressure situations where, and there's often three things that will trigger that human stress response, being unknown uncertainty, high consequence of outcome, and being outside of comfort zone. There's a couple of other ones that will float in around that. But if you think about any high pressure, high consequence moment that maybe you've experienced, or maybe even listeners, when they're thinking about some of these things, usually you can boil a lot of things down in an acute moment of execution. There's one of those three, if not all three of those things, that go in and around a high pressure, high consequence type moment. So if we haven't trained for that, and we're not aware of what happens to me as a human, or what happens to the people that I'm leading, or what can happen at organizational or even societal level with those three things, performance will start to fall apart. And I just kept seeing this theme over and over and over again, without really solutions back then of how do we plug that gap. And it becomes really costly, in the environments that I work in. Sometimes it's lives on the line. It's tens of millions of dollars if it's in the corporate environment, or it's championship of an NBA basketball team, which the value to that in terms of fan base and all of those things, it's significant, right? And it gets looked at almost by boards and executive leaders and whatever, almost as, oh, we just didn't do well under pressure, rather than actually I can come into an organization and I can almost predict whether you're going to be able to handle when things go bad, or when the pressure really comes on. And because we can predict for that, we can actually solve for that out in front. But there's this lack of awareness of what goes on at that level for humans and for teams.
Yeah, I think lack of awareness is definitely a term that we're going to use a few times through the rest of this conversation, because it's systemic, right? And you'd think the amount of, if we stay in sport for a second before we go into the real serious stuff in cyber and special forces and the like, the ability to take a free throw, a penalty kick, a field goal, what have you, right? These set piece moments of high consequence compared to the muscle memory of throwing a pass or, throwing a punch or what have you, right? Obviously very, very different operating system. Is that where you find the breakdown generally, or not breakdown, but where the most work goes into? How do we hit kinesiology, almost the repeatable outcome of you do this, it goes through the goal? Is that where you spend a lot of time, or is it in general, let's get you thinking from the day that you start your day to the minute that your 90 minutes in a football game is up? Where does your kind of where does your expertise come in at that point, and where do you generally help people in that area?
Yeah, Josh, that's a great question, because everyone wants to solve it at the moment of pressure, right?
Yeah.
And I would say that 90% of the time when I'm working with a team or an individual or an organization where things fall apart in high consequence moments, it's usually got less to do with that moment of pressure, and it's got more to do with everything else that's going on that has effectively absorbed somebody's buffer. I often talk about buffer in the system, particularly when we're talking about things like a cumulative load. And how that just absorbs the fact that when you then come into a high consequence moment, if you've got no buffer in the system to absorb the very normal and very predictable uplift and elevation and arousal state that you get, the heightened heart rate, the slightly tight breathing, the slight narrowing of vision, or the loss of kind of hearing things so well, and that the cognitive bandwidth kind of starts to retreat a little bit, and shrink down. That's a very predictable response in a human when the consequence gets high. Now, normally, if you've got enough buffer in the system, you can absorb that uplift and arousal state without crossing that threshold that we were talking about. But so often people want to solve it at that moment of execution. And funnily, you raise a free throw. One of my clients many years ago was an NBA player, and in a practice scenario, his free throw percent was high 70s. In games, it was sort of low 20s. Now that shouldn't happen, right? Because to your point, it's a very predictable, repeatable skill. But on a Monday morning after a game, he'd be back practicing free throws, thinking, oh, I'm failing at the task. I need to practice the task more times. Me with the beam mount, I fall on a Saturday, I'm back in the gymnasium Monday morning, repeating the beam mount over and over again, thinking I just need to get better at the beam mount. And you asked about common themes. One of the ones I often talk about is what I call the technical tactical hope strategy, right? People get so focused, and this is very applicable to your environment and the cyber world, very focused on the technical and tactical aspects of craft, so to speak, whether that's managing a cyber incident, whether that's a beam mount, whether it's it doesn't matter, what it is, and then just hope that it shows up under pressure, without actually having an understanding of, okay, when we put humans in this environment, we're going to see these things change. So have we actually trained them to have an awareness that they can self-aware when they've started to notice that things are changing? And then more importantly, have they got some de-escalation strategies within themselves? But also, has Overwatch or has leadership got a same awareness? And then people that are having to make decisions, boards, executive leadership teams, are they having an understanding of what happens to humans in high pressure so that they can factor some of that in? And we can talk about a whole bunch of stories that you want to go down on any of that, about that predictability and what we're not training for.
Do you think it's got better? And I say that because I notice these things just as a sports fan, and I watch, for instance, the NRL. After the end of every try, every team now, they all get in a huddle together and they do breath work. And it's so noticeable because it didn't used to be the way, certainly only a couple of years ago. But do you think that people are starting to clock on to this as a concept, and more so where you're focused than just, hey, we need to be in that moment, as I mentioned before, with like, the set piece opportunities and such?
Um, I hesitate on that because I think yes, and I think what we're seeing is people clock on to the shiny, and they think that it's the getting in the huddle after the thing that's, that's actually handling pressure. We do, and breath work has got, unfortunately, it's become a bit of a buzz and shiny word in that space for handling pressure. And I would often think about those sorts of strategies in that moment. They're almost like vitamins, right? And the ability to perform under pressure is much more like your nutrition. So if you have one little strategy that you do, and that's your vitamin, and you take your multivitamin, but for breakfast you eat fried chicken, and lunch you eat pizza, and dinner you eat fish and chips, and then you take your multivitamin. The multivitamin doesn't take the edge off the really crappy nutrition. So if you've got, but if your nutrition is amazing, then those supplements can be game changers. So if you've got an environment which is toxic, there's poor leadership, there is, lack of purpose and connection, there is terrible communication, there is a fear-driven environment, and even how leaders lead in a way can often set people up for, it's very fear-driven. It's basically the don't fail. I think you and I were talking about this just before we started recording, but I've seen it increasingly in the work that I'm doing in cyber, the pressure on a CISO. If you stuff it up, you're getting punted, and the similarity I see in that is the manager of a Premier League team, where they have usually about, 3 or 4 weeks. And if they're not getting wins, then they're the guy that's getting punted. And yet team ownership doesn't look at board, like the whole other infrastructure, the second and third order effects of some of the decisions that get made upstream, that puts that manager or that CISO in that environment that it's almost like we can't win, right? So coming back to that football question that you asked, I think a lot of people are still focused too much on the vitamins without actually looking at what in our organization, have we done a pressure audit to understand where and how are we actually making decisions upstream that maybe it makes sense on a budget line item, or when we're having to be answerable to shareholders, or our team of directors who might not necessarily understand technology and cyber. And that, yes, that makes a lot of sense in that decision that we make, without understanding the second, third order effect that is actually significantly ramped up the pressure and consequence and the lack, and the risk really of things going south, because those people don't understand what actually happens down in that environment, not just the technical, tactical, but also that pressure of, you got someone who's lying awake 2 o'clock in the morning, just hoping tomorrow morning's not going to be the day that, we get a breach and everything goes south, as an example.
I love that you've managed to segue into where I was going next without me having to say anything. Because I could sit and talk about sport all day, and I think it's a great space to be in. It's an area, obviously, that we have a shared interest in, but I really want to get to how that then manifests into our world. Talk to me a bit about the line between elite sport, special forces, and cyber. It's not something you hear all of put in a box together. What's the similarities, and when did you kind of first realize that there was some, or that there was some synergies in the problems they're solving?
Yeah, and I think come back to what we spoke at right in the beginning, probably when we did the intro, right, is that my fascination and the area that I work in is the human system, right? And so most humans, we've got the same fears, self-doubts, insecurities, right? We've got the same neurophysiology. We've got those same things that are still thousands of years old, even though technology has moved well forward from that. The original connection, I mean, obviously with my background, spent a lot of time working in professional sport globally, and still continue to. Um, there were some people within special forces who came across some of my work and asked if I could come and do very similar, because they were starting to see common themes of putting our guys in high pressure environments, especially through training when they're relatively young, high anxiety, losing people, just even through poor task failure, not necessarily the anxiety side of it, but task failure, overwhelm, lack of cognitive bandwidth, those sorts of things, similar things that we were talking about. And thankfully, the thing I love about special operations is that they generally are very focused on excellence. How do we get better? And are very humble in that. So they're very curious, they're humble, they will seek solutions. They don't have an arrogance. It's like, no, we've got it sorted, we're fine, which you see in a lot of other environments, and we can certainly talk about that if you want to. So that was where it started to come into the special operations environment, and very privileged to now get asked not only just with helping guys, but also even some of the systems level within that, bit more intentional and architecting. Within that environment, of course, warfare is changing. So it's moving away from, just what we'd more traditionally think about warfare and what our special operations force needs to do. But of course, cyber AI, can add, all of that was starting to come into the battle space, especially off the back of Ukraine. And so I think that started to have because I was already in that world, I was getting some exposure to how is this actually going to change what our humans are going to need to do in terms of ethical decision making, scale of consequence of making mistakes, the human being the, I guess, the interface layer between technology and, some of the other execution pieces, right? So that was what started that. In terms of me seeing the relevance into some of these more tech and cyber environments. And then I think even evolving from that, just because now cyber and AI, just in recent years, in general public, I know people in your world, it's been around for forever, right? But I think in general society, it's become a lot more of a threat and a lot more of an opportunity in probably the last 4 or 5 years for the majority of people in normal society, right? And so within that, organizations are being faced with the consequence of that. And I come back to a sport analogy. And I think for myself as an athlete, where when I was competing, even let's say it was an Olympic Games, and let's say, and I think about this as a CISO as the analogy, right? But as a gymnast, let's say I had to go to the Olympic Games, win a gold medal in gymnastics. If I didn't win the gold medal, my country was kicking me out, right? Now, to build up to that 4-year pinnacle event, I've got lots of smaller competitions. I've got international exposure. I can go up against competition. I can come back. I can iterate. I can evolve. I kind of know by the time I get to the Olympic Games what my routine is going to be, who I'm competing against, who the judges are likely to be, and it's kind of predictable where the outcome is going to be. I just need to execute under pressure at the biggest peak. And then I was talking with this analogy, and I said to a friend, it's kind of like with what I see in the cyber, and particularly the responsibility on a CISO. It's almost like you have to prepare for 4 years, go to the Olympic Games, but you don't get to do any of those little competitions along the way. You just have to go from training to Olympic game gold medal, otherwise you get booted out of the country. In terms of the application, do you know what I mean? In terms of skill application under pressure. And he said, Rach, it's actually worse than that. It's very similar analogy. However, we train for those 4 years without knowing what sport we have to train for. And we have to just be ready to be able to execute no matter what, with that immense consequence and pressure. And we don't have that same preparation and iteration and those sorts of things, right? So my takeaway from some of that conversation was, in an environment where in many ways the consequence of outcome and getting it right is almost higher than almost any of these other environments that I get to work into, why is this so novel and new? When I first started talking about it with some of my peer groups and some of the other international networks I was exposed to through either intelligence or cyber or those sorts of things, they were like, this is awesome, but we haven't even thought about that, right? Because we just didn't even think it was a thing. And that actually blew my mind. And so because part of my driver, and this is the move away, I guess, from sport into some of these other environments, right, is this importance of really stewarding, like humans that have to do really high consequence things. Are we ensuring that we have built the capability in them to be able to do that repeatedly, not just at that go moment, Hopefully if a CISO is exposed to a breach, they don't get many of them, right? But there's a whole lot of years built around their career where the pressure and consequence of thought, all of that stuff is it's not just a one moment, right? It's a daily basis for multiple years.
It's a constant state of fight or flight in some way, shape, or form, isn't it? Because your entire thought process from the moment you start in cybersecurity is your job is to prevent a breach. It's the boogeyman that sat there, and you're always thinking about it. And touch wood, hopefully, it's not something you have to deal with all the time. But yeah, the vast majority of people have something to do with some sort of issue in that sense.
Mm.
Where's the breakdown? Is it a case of boards not getting it, or leaders not getting it, or technology leaders not getting it? Because obviously the three kind of groups we just talked about, everyone will do anything for a 1% increase in sport. Special forces guys, we get it, we understand, we need to be operating at our best. Just get on with it in cyber. It feels a little bit.
Yeah, possibly it's a little bit of the lack of understanding that we talked about before, not understanding that one of the things I often talk through is don't fix broken, create awesome, right? And sometimes there's a lack of awareness and understanding that actually when you intentionally design for better returns, good results, an organization that is intentionally designed for great output and success, however your organization or your commercial entity is measuring that, by default, you actually move the needle away from, the things kind of going wrong, right? So sometimes there's a lack of awareness of that, even just of building a high performance organization. And there's often a misunderstanding of what is a high performance organization. And dare I say it, even in many of the high performance organizations I've worked in, and, as we said, NBA, NRL, AFL, World Rugby, like Premier League, some of these really significant, inverted commas, high performance organizations, they're not actually often high performance in how you would think that they could and should be. And that's another thing. So I think yes, lack of awareness, lack of understanding and awareness of the predictability of the breakdown in high pressure. If you put someone in that environment and there's no buffer between their arousal state and their threshold, and they get the normal increase in arousal state at go moment, which we talked about is really normal, very predictable, and it has them cross their thresholds, then you get that shutdown in communication. So you'll see someone withdraw and shut down, or you'll see someone who is not who shouldn't be stepping up and being vocal is stepping up and being vocal, because that is where they go to with communication. You'll see people's smart decision brain literally go offline. So even though you might have run all of those simulations or those tabletops or those training drills, and it's like, and someone will go to the board and say, hey, this is our strategy for if there's a breach. Does it all that makes, yeah, that all makes sense.
Yeah.
That was trained though when people's smart brain was online, they don't understand that actually put them in that environment, that smart brain's not going to be online. Risk taking actually changes. So you might have worked through, if we get to this part of a breach, then someone's going to have to make this high risk decision to cut off a system or take a particular action, right? When someone's in that heightened arousal state, their ability to execute on that is probably going to change. So you're going to get a hesitation, and you're going to get a delay, and you might get people that'll spend an hour going around a circle talking about something, and they're not actually have the ability to execute on the decision that was actually made in a calm environment. As an example, we hear and see people that'll mishear things. So someone will be over someone's shoulder giving them an instruction to do something. Me, the recipient of that, might acknowledge, yes, I heard you, and I proceed to do the exact same thing as if I haven't heard you, because my auditory awareness shuts down in that moment, right? Now, I can imagine that everybody on the board or everyone in the leadership team understands in their own world what happens when they get really under pressure and really under the pump, and they get snappy, or they don't make good decisions or whatever. But they don't think about, well, how does that apply down in the coalface when we've got these people that we're asking to execute on some really significant high consequence things, and they don't consider the degradation and capability and capacity for those humans out there doing the doing.
They absolutely don't. And I think that there's a special set of circumstances that are extremely high pressure in these sort of environments. You don't have to look very far for the consequences of those actions being quite dire. And to your point, yeah, you're right. You might get cut from a football team. You probably get picked up by another one if you're any good, but something like this can be very, very difficult if you're a CISO. Um, how do they go about, well, how do you go about, maybe is a better word, helping people on that journey? And what does that timeline look like for training this mentality, this skill set, this thought process? Is it a skill set thought process, or what does it look like from your perspective when you start having conversations with people about this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It really depends on the entry level that people are coming in when they first engage with this, right? And it is that concept of needing to meet people where they're at, because sometimes I'm talking with people where they haven't even considered this, right? To your point, um, and you and I were talking again just before we started recording about an environment within special operations where they were training guys to jump out of planes, right, with the parachuting. And one of the old guys who didn't understand it had come from that mentality of just suck it up and deal with it. And you can either handle the pressure of the job or you can't, right? And this wasn't, they didn't say this to me, they said this to leadership, when leadership who is younger and more modern and understands some of these capabilities. We're talking about the importance of training their guys for this. And they talked about, well, if you've got a guy who is standing at the edge of the plane and you need to, calm them down so they can jump, right? The word that they used is a very English word, but was mollycoddling them, right? Surely that's mollycoddling them, trying to teach them how to stay calm so they can jump out of the plane. They can either do it or they can't. We don't want the guys that can't. And to me, it's like, well, but you teach the guys how to actually, put their kit on, get to the edge of the plane, when and how and why to open the chute, you teach them all of that, but so teaching them a skill that intentionally keeps their cognitive bandwidth online so they can execute what you just taught us, surely that's actually part of the skill learning for executing in high pressure environments. It's not something to leave to chance, right? Because the reality of these environments is that pressure is a constant, right? Whether you have architected the ability to excel in those is kind of the thing that often is the variable, right? So sometimes it's about working with the board and leadership for them to understand, and I would say within any group across any arena I've ever presented, when I've really presented some of the frameworks that we work through with them, it's absolute no-brainer, and they get it because it's not this fluffy, waffly, well-being topic or whatever. It's actually, hey, this is human, science and physiology and the performance and, all that sort of stuff. And it just makes sense, right? And it's very applicable. So they then start to understand how it's going to be relevant for increased capability and outcomes almost in the performance metrics, whatever the performance metrics are that they're looking for. So sometimes it needs to start there. Sometimes though, like I've just run a workshop with a very large UK organisation. It would be, hundreds of millions of pounds probably in terms of their operating scale. And we just started literally with them. We're doing a workshop down with their cyber team as an example. Now from there, it was like, their feedback was, we want to take this now up into leadership, and we also want to take it down into some of the others down in the ground, so that everybody working through that can, has the same capabilities. That same organisation had recently done a, gold, silver, bronze kind of combined, what's the word? That simulation. And what they found was really interesting was the gold level, when it got to actually executing on the thing, they didn't reference back to any of the playbooks. They didn't reference back to any of the things that they were actually meant to do. Now, thankfully, they made really good decisions, and what they thought to action on through that was apparently really good. However, same scenario, those people doing that simulation that were making those smart decisions were still doing it in a very calm environment. There was nothing really riding on it. So the danger in that is they've learned, we make good decisions under pressure, right? Because we did it really well in the simulation. I think simulations don't take things right to the level of, but are you running that when you've got communication breakdowns, when you've got, poor decision making, you've got lack of fine motor, and you've got that lack of situational awareness? That's when you need to be thinking through with these playbooks, with these task executions, is that going to land? when that's the operating state of the human beings that we've got online. And even the vibe in the room, we talk about stress being a contagion, right? So there's that piece too.
Well, it's very hard to simulate, isn't it? Effectively,
Yeah.
you kind of don't want people to have to be in that scenario often either.
Mm.
Are some people just predisposed to dealing with this, have a different window of stress management, or can perform better under pressure? Is there natural predispositions to people in this space?
Oh, that's a great question. Um, hmm. Without getting really deep, because I think some of the science shows some people that are really calm under pressure as adults have actually had quite traumatic childhoods, right? And so pressure and chaos is actually their comfort zone. So I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole.
No.
Yes, though, certainly some people are. However, I think an important thing to understand, which is quite freeing, is someone might, we talked about the three things that turn on the threat response: out of comfort zone, unknown uncertainty, high consequence of outcome. The out of comfort zone is a really important piece, because very often people, like think about the special force operator, right? Or the NBA player, or the CEO of that really significant corporate environment. That environment becomes their comfort zone, right? So yeah, they're very good at that kinetic engagement, or that NBA game, or whatever. It's And so they get mistakenly believing about themselves that they can handle pressure, and then you put them in an environment that is way outside their comfort zone, that they've never had to do before. And thinking about in that special force environment, sometimes I've said to guys, what are your real high peak, high pressure moments? For many of them, it's got nothing to do with kinetic engagement and warfare. It might be, I have to put on a suit and be MC at my best mate's wedding. It might be, I have to change the diaper of my 6-month-old screaming baby. It might be, I have to brief a superior to get a mission approved, right? And the challenge is, if people don't understand their own nervous system and their own operating state, suddenly they go from someone who can handle pressure over here, and then they're like, okay, but why now have I got sweaty palms and a dry mouth and a racing heart when I'm trying to be in these environments, right? That's the danger that I see in some of the performance environments, where people are looking to either simulate the pressure, and we see that in sport all the time. One of the biggest questions I get asked by teams is, how do we simulate that pressure so people get good at handling the pressure, right? And it's like, actually, you probably want to teach people a tool in their back pocket that they can pull out so they can de-escalate their own arousal state no matter what triggered it. Is actually a far better fail-safe than, we're going to train you for the 1,000 potential scenarios that might come down the pipe at you. And the challenge with that is, it's actually the 1,001st one that is the one you're going to face, and then you've got no strategies for that. So I think that can be a thing in terms of, can people naturally handle pressure? One of the other things that we see too is, we'll see outwardly, or even ourselves, where you might outwardly see someone who loses it in a situation that, to you or I, we might look at it and go, that was a huge overreaction to something that wasn't really a big deal. Someone has a complete meltdown, they completely lose it, whatever. In that environment, it's important to probably step back and go, actually, they're not reacting to that thing. They are probably reacting to everything that's accumulated in their nervous system. In science, it's called allostatic load, right? It's a whole bunch of stuff that just accumulates over time, and of significance, that will turn on our human threat response. And if you get to a point where you're just cruising with your arousal state just under your red line all the time, which is a lot of humanity at the moment, then the smallest little thing, it might be the dickhead that cuts you off in traffic, right? And you completely lose it. Right now, it's understanding it's probably not the dickhead that cut you off in traffic. And if any of your listeners are thinking, yeah, that's me, I blow up at every Sydney driver that cuts me off on the drive in, you're not reacting to that. You're reacting to potentially the poor night's sleep, the relationship argument that you just had, the fact that you've got, a lot of work pressure or whatever, right? So a good litmus test in that, I call it the 3 dickhead rule, is to self-aware, right, is to go, if you meet 1 dickhead by lunchtime, fair chance it's probably them. If you meet 3 dickheads by lunchtime, there's a fair chance it's probably you. So it's a really good way just to self-reflect, to go, where is my arousal state? Where is my operating state at an individual level, kind of on a daily basis? And if I'm kind of like, yeah, everyone's a dickhead by lunchtime, it's probably a good, hey, I need to step back and work out how to put a bit more buffer into my system and into my operating state, because and we talked about this when we were working with this really large UK organization. What they realize is, man, most of them are just showing up every day to work. And this is most leaders, this is most people in high pressure environments already showing up to work because of everything that's going on in life with their arousal state just under their red line. There's not a lot of buffer for things to go wrong. And that is really concerning for me, when, especially if I was a director or on the executive leadership team, in terms of risk mitigation, right, which is a primary action of a director, is in terms of thinking about risk, is that most people have limited capability already in the systems before we then land that really high pressure, high consequence thing. Now, thankfully, to come back to one of your earlier questions, some environments, professional sport, elite military, are starting to look at how do we put a little bit more buffer in our system, knowing that's going to go wrong. To me, in your world, there is a huge capability advantage to organizations and teams that actually start to look at their organization with some of that in the mix. I'll leave you with one last story on that, because this might really hit it home. This is within a special military environment, and we were running a training drill. That it was a very complex drill. The guys are very well qualified, and there was a lot of complexity in the task that they needed to execute for this particular thing. It was basically mimicking a hostage rescue. And the instructors had come up with the training scenario. And when they came to do it, the instructor said to me, Rach, if you want to see how this should get done, watch this guy, because he's our best guy, And this guy, in inverted commas, ended up making a fatal flaw. He missed a booby trap on a doorway, and had that been in a field environment, would have killed him and his teammate instantly, right? Because he would have blown up the explosive. He would have tripped the explosive. And this guy was devastated, he was white in the face, as you can imagine, because they take that level of training really seriously. And when we were doing the debrief afterwards, he was like, Rach, when you presented those models in the classroom, he goes, it made so much sense. And one of the models being primarily around buffer, that allostatic load, and then the peak environment. And he said, and I got it, and it made so much sense. He said, but I didn't think it applied to me because I handle pressure really, really well. Coming back to your point, right? He goes, I handle pressure really well. He said, however, he goes, last night I had a really bad argument with my girlfriend. They'd been together for about 4 years. They ended up breaking up. He goes, I didn't sleep all last night. He said, and I thought that I could just come in, put my game face on, and execute. And that's a classic military kind of thing. Same with sport. I can compartmentalize. I can put my personal life away over there. I can show up. I can be at work, and I can do my job. And that mentally and emotionally makes a whole lot of sense. However, we can't compartmentalize on our physiology. So, the lack of sleep, the high pressure, the failure of the relationship, all of that life stuff meant his physiology, he was already at such a heightened state with no buffer in his system. And then when we put him in his very normal environment, that he was his comfort zone and that he was exceptionally well trained at, he didn't have the buffer to absorb the normal elevation of state, and everything fell apart. That was literally a critical, that was life and death sort of situation, right? Now, I know that sounds like a very dramatic environment, and probably your listeners are going, yeah, I'm not showing up to a hostage rescue on a daily basis. No, however, there is probably for many of your listeners in similar environments where, man, there is actually a lot riding on the line, and maybe you don't see the immediacy of that was a life on the line. However, the flow and effect of some of those things can pretty significantly derail an organization or livelihoods pretty freaking fast, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have a couple of, I'll come back to a couple of quick fire questions at the end of it. There's one that's burning for me throughout that entire piece. And I think it's the one that probably, Pete, you get asked all the time. How do people go about building buffer?
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, there's nothing shiny, there's nothing sexy, and there's no quick fix, right? When you understand, yeah, I know, right? And certainly, and we haven't gone through too much into the reads in this podcast, and I've got a couple of podcasts on my website if anyone really wants to go into reads with it. I'd be so happy to to do more of a technical session with any of your listeners or anyone who wants to jump on. But when you understand what are the things that turn on the human threat response in the first place, right? And I know I gave you the big three buckets. That was more in the acute moment. And in terms of the accumulation, the allostatic load, it's the classics: poor sleep, alcohol, high sugar diet, energy drinks, recreation drugs, things like chronic pain, TBI, which is traumatic brain injury. And then it's things like life issues, it's relationship stuff, it's the work pressures, it's all of those things. And then it's some of the more grey stuff, fear of failure, fear of success, fear of what people think, lack of purpose, imposter syndrome. Like, there's a whole stack of things, and I'm more than happy to shoot that through to you. And that's in the science called allostatic load. And the magic is understanding how many of those things have I got and over what period of time, to understand how much it's impacting my arousal state, my baseline arousal state. And what's fascinating is whenever I present that into a group, doesn't matter whether it's, professional sport, special forces, corporate, do a lot of stuff in trauma medicine as well. And I'll say, who's had at least 3 or 4 of these things in the last 3 months? And inevitably every hand goes up, and it's because it's not that we're not cut out for these environments, or that person's weak or soft, which is so often, unfortunately, the misbelief that gets thrown around in that, right? But it's called being a human being. And so first of all, it's understanding what of those things on the list are my big ticket items. What do I know really elevates my arousal state over time? And then in terms of the building buffer, it's choosing those things and then finding an antidote or working on those things, right? And I know that's a very grey answer. It's hard to be a little bit more specific probably until we sort of go through some of those things. But, elite high performance is about doing the common uncommonly well, right? So some of those basics, sleeping really well, good hydration, moving your body, having some sort of like something that's, your outlet, something that kind of gives you joy or connection or gratitude as a human being, right? Some of those things that, again, people don't get excited by that because it's almost seen as soft and like, not the tactical under the pump at the knife's edge kind of execution. But it really is the big thing that makes a difference on buffer.
It's the foundation, right? If you build a house on sand, it's not going to work. But if you build a good foundation, everything above it will be multiplied in its use case.
Yeah, I mean, human. There's some pretty clear non-negotiables of human performance, right? And it's not a Rachel Vickery list. It's built in science. It's built in neurophysiology. It's built in everything about it. We need to sleep. Sleep deprivation is one of the most effective interrogation strategies because human beings don't run well on lack of sleep. Eating really clean. Knowing how to sort of breathe in a way that, and I don't mean breath work at all. I mean, just like, do you know how to breathe in a way that keeps your calm nervous system online all of the time in the background when you're not thinking about it? Are you moving your body? Have you got deep connection? Do you have real purpose? Have you got a life purpose that's a contribution to something bigger than yourself? Some of those, have you got an internal North Star and you know what you're about and why you're operating in the way that you do, so you can always come back to that no matter what the chaos is around you? Some of those things are really core to us as a human being, and that's where the buffer sits. But it sounds almost so easy, or as humans, we like to be comfortable, right? And so we often we go, oh, I need to do those things, but I don't get to it. And then I'm, people are often saying, I'm constantly feeling in this, I'm constantly overwhelmed, I'm constantly pressured, I'm constantly stuffing things up, everybody's a dickhead in the traffic, because they're living life at red line all of the time. And it's a very reactive, kind of unfun way to live life. And it's often aligned with people that tend to, blow their life up and have a lot of chaos all the time, as opposed to people who are exceptional in leadership in particular, and these really high consequence type environments. They know how to regulate themselves. They know how to stay really calm. Some of the best leaders in the world that I know, who I just, often look at in awe with the consequence that they have to carry, but far more importantly, the way that they show up and lead in those environments. I know firsthand, pay a whole lot of attention to some of those buffer strategies so that they can show up every day in a way that they can absorb no matter what's going to come at them down the pipe. And I think our leaders could do a much better job in taking on some of that, because they are how they show up significantly impacts right through the organization.
100%. I couldn't agree with that last sentence more. And it's funny because I personally sat in a room yesterday with 16 CEOs, and we talked about a lot of this. And the whole part of the session was actually about this their thought processes, how they were feeling, personal world. At the start of every session, they ask, out of 10, how are you personally? And out of 10, how's the business? And without fail, there was not a single person. Actually, no, I lie. There was one person who was business was terrible and life was great. Everyone else, it was the inverse. Everyone business was 8 or 9 or 7 or whatever it might be, but personal was always no better than 7. And that is for the same reasons. They're not working out enough, they're not getting enough time, balance, and all that. Now that I'm talking to you, I can see every person in that room to some degree or another redlining it. And
I think
it's hard.
can I jump in on that? Because that's a really great and common thing that I see a lot, right? Because whoever's doing often the training of those leaders or setting up into that organization is not, because they don't necessarily understand particularly the physiology and the neurophysiology of executing in really high consequence environments. They're not necessarily good at drawing the through line as to how and why did these things over here significantly impact performance. And the nice thing about my world is that I get to work with people who are often very, very alpha, very the good version of alpha, alpha humans. They are that hard charges often. They are excellence driven. They carry a lot of consequence, and they usually show up. They want to show up because they've got a not so much professional sport, but certainly most of the other environments, they're showing up in an environment where there's a connection to a purpose bigger than just themselves. And I guess in professional sport, but it's kind of a little bit different. But there's not a through line and understanding of how does this stuff, it's not about well-being, it's not about feeling good, it's not about let's make sure that our people are okay, and I say that awfully, and that probably sounds like I don't have any respect for it. It's not the case, but I think we're doing a massive disservice to our people who have to operate in these real high pressure, high consequence environments, who are alpha driven, competitive. They want to be excellent, they want to be outstanding. It's helping them understand that actually this stuff makes you even better at what you want to do, and far more importantly, it keeps our really highly capable humans online for longer, right? Because I think too often we lose a lot of wisdom, a lot of skill, a lot of experience, a lot of everything, because people go, man, I'm out of here. This is just not sustainable, and we lose all of that stuff that probably would have made an organization better. And I'll be fascinated in your view, but coming back to CISOs, right? And I think I've got a special little soft spot for CISOs, because I just, to me, they epitomize almost the pressure that is in this environment. But to me, if I was a board and I had a cyber breach, I would not be firing the CISO unless it was a pretty significant, flagrant, hey, it was legitimately, whatever. Because to me, I want someone who's been through that, rode through that, has the experience of how to navigate an organization through that. The learned experience and skill you get from that, man, to me, that's highly valuable. Would you not want to keep that on to actually, again, risk mitigation down the track? Anyway, that's a little
You're right. Yeah.
a little aside.
You've done it once, right? You should know how to do it or prevent it happening again.
Yeah.
And most, I think, that would be applicable. Funny enough, so I put a little blurb out on our conversation to our executive community, the lounge, and I had all of them actually. Now I look at it, CISOs, who have sent some questions in. So we don't usually do it on this podcast, but this is one that I thought would resonate with the group, and it certainly did. I'll fire them at you, and we'll try to kind of get through them in a relatively succinct order here. But the first one here is, how do leaders actually identify these kind of situations? They've coined it as burnout in their teams, particularly amongst younger professionals who lack self-awareness to recognize it themselves, or feel that the expectation is simply to push through.
How do leaders see it in their people? Yeah. I think as you've started to get a feel as we've worked through this conversation, I do tend to work more on the create, awesome, not fix, broken. So to me, if a team or organization is doing things exceptionally well, they're not seeing burnout in the first place. But I will answer the question. You're going to see people that are just checked out, right? You're probably going to see those overreactions to things that aren't a big deal. You're seeing people taking more time off. You're seeing people not putting their hand up. You're probably seeing a lot of small errors consistently being made. You're not going to see that engagement. But I think it's not just about what are you noticing and seeing in burnout. It's actually more importantly is once you've recognized it, what are you going to do about it? And then more importantly, how do you go left of boom, or how do you go upstream of that and go, why are we seeing burnout in the first place? Because if you're in an organization and you're spotting burnout often in some of your younger or more inexperienced people, it's not a character flaw, right? You've got to look at the system structure of your organization and going, how are we setting up our people for that in the first place? And then more importantly, are we asking them questions? What's going on? Why are you feeling this? How do we actually put some things in place? But normally, if you've got an organization that's set up for awesome performance, and it's not just, hey, beat people up until they work 100-hour weeks and then they do stuff, right? There's great purpose, there's great sense of belonging. People feel valued. They know what their role is. They get feedback on how well they're doing in their role. There's good communication. It's an opportunity building environment. It's not a fear-driven environment. You're less likely to get burnout in those environments. Lack of purpose, I think, is a big one for burnout. And I was just talking to someone who, very, very good friend of mine, just been appointed into a phenomenal role. And they were funny because they were just about to retire off a very, very successful career. And they were pretty tired. They'd been carrying a lot of consequence for a long time. And they were like, oh, kind of pretty worn out, and they got tapped on the shoulder to do this role, which of course is a role that you're going to say yes to, and he's like, I've just got this whole new lease of life because now I've got this next level of purpose and contribution and value in making an impact, so funnily enough, as humans, it's quite funny of what and when, how burnout shows up and then how we can actually get rid of it.
Who would have thought good environments equal good outcomes? I know that's a massive simplification, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And I'm actually going to go one further on that because there's one other question in there that I thought kind of lines up, and you can tell that people haven't had enough of your understanding yet. So hopefully they'll ask better questions after understanding this discussion. But what should organizations be doing differently, and how do leaders go and make the case to the next level up in the board, etc., to showcase, hey, look, we should be doing. Everyone does EAPs and they do resilience, they do all this other stuff, but it's clearly not working. What advice would you give to a CISO sitting there today going, I need to do something differently and let's solve the root cause and not the symptom, as we've just alluded to?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the fact that, in terms of that word resilience, we've kind of moved, we haven't talked about that much, because I tend to use that term adaptive capability, and I think when we're talking about capability and capacity, and human capability and human capacity, I think that can help people make that argument, because it's actually, we're going to have people who are better at being able to do their job. They're going to be able to make better decisions. They're going to be more efficient. They're going to be more efficacious. It's framing it, it's understanding what language the board or the ELT speak, and then knowing how you need to translate your world into what outcomes they're chasing, right? And so I remember Melbourne Storm brought me in to work with them a number of years ago, and it was quite funny because the performance director needed to make a case forward about whether they spent money on bringing me in, or whether I think the football director wanted to spend money on an electronic whiteboard, and he needed to, because on a line item it's a spend, right? However, he needed to be able to go, what is the value proposition for us putting this thing in place? And so I think when you can align it with better decision making, better human capability, we're going to have less, it's risk mitigation, right? On a whole lot of levels in terms of whatever your organization is trying to avoid happening. But of course, most boards don't want to spend money on something that might happen or might not happen if we do this thing, because it's very hard to measure the ROI on that. It's okay, how does this increase either productivity or outcome or retention or capability or those sorts of things. It's a performance outcome justification, not a prevent broken.
I hope you beat the whiteboard. I hope
I did.
they went with your way. That's good.
Yeah,
There's a reason to store the
It was very humbling though. It was
Well,
awesome.
I've never been compared to a whiteboard in my life, so there's something.
Electronic whiteboard, Josh.
Sorry,
Electronic whiteboard.
sorry, a fancy whiteboard.
Fancy whiteboard.
Any final thoughts you'd like to share?
I think we could. I mean, I think we could probably talk about all this stuff for forever. Hey, and this is something that's may or may not be relevant specifically to the listeners listening to this, especially those that are really getting engaged for this for the first time. But I think where my thinking is going, just watching what's happening. Again, we're spending so much, right? And coming back to the military and what got me into cyber, there's so much spend on the technology, right? On the technical capability. And I don't think as a global society, the lack of technical capability is going to be the problem. I think it's going to be, have we actually invested enough in human wisdom and human judgment and the stewardship of the knowledge and the capacity that we have as humans, to steward, I guess, that technology that we've got coming down the pipeline. And to me, that's where the game changer of investment, can be, right? Because we have to actually make sure, right, that we've actually intentionally built that capability into the humans that are being entrusted with the running of the tech, and whether that's political leaders, industry leaders, corporate leaders, or the CISO, right? It doesn't really matter. I think that stewardship of the human capability piece, to me, is actually where I see that we really need to invest more in as the future comes down the pipe at us pretty fast. Because I think there's so much uncertainty, isn't there, in society at the moment, just across the board, on so many levels. There's trust breakdowns, right? Who do we trust? Where do we trust? Some pretty fundamental themes that, when we peel it back to unknown uncertainty, high consequence of outcome, outside of comfort zone, most people are redlining in life, not just what's happening in the business organization. So I think the more we can have even these sorts of conversations, I feel grateful to you, Josh, that you indulged in having this conversation, because it must have felt a little bit high risk outside. It's like, well, we don't talk about this stuff, right? Or there's, I know some organizations that work a little bit more in the mental health space in cyber, right? But I think if we can reframe it around performance and optimization and human capability and capacity in these environments, it actually becomes a lot more fun and creative.
Makes total sense to me. I mean, look, I'm not an example of doing it well at times, to redline, etc. But I think this is going to resonate with people, and it should resonate with people because it's a very clear and obvious gap that we can improve within our own control. If people are sat here now, which hopefully they will be, interested, engaged, going, all right, great, what's next? How do they best get in touch with you, find more about the work you do, maybe dive into the more technical stuff that we talked about before?
Yeah, thanks for that offer. My website is rachelvickery.com. There's a resource page on there, which has got a lot of different podcasts that I've done with different people, some in military, some in sport, some in just, other environments, where we do talk a little bit more about some of the strategies and things if they want to go down there. Note, though, that those are very much more at individual level rather than, okay, how do we architect a whole organization? And to me, that's where the magic happens. So more than happy for them to reach out to me by email as well, or on LinkedIn is probably where I am most active.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for the time. Thank you for sharing everything. And I'm sure you're going to get some knocks on the door after this one.
Josh, thanks for having me on. Absolute pleasure.
Thank you.